Welcome. You're listening to another episode of AML Conversations, where we sit down with some of the brightest minds in the financial industry to explore topical matters around financial crime and compliance. We hope you enjoy this discussion, and please be sure to subscribe for more.
Alan, how are you doing today?
John, I'm good. How are you? This is fun.
Yes, this is going to be one for the record books here. So let's go back. We've chatted offline a bit, and online, but not recording. We about an aspect of the AML challenges globally that don't get talked about enough from my perspective, and that is the private sector's involvement in all the themes that we have to grapple with, whether it's correspondent bank due diligence, private banking, terrorist financing, all the things that obviously FATF from their government representatives pass on to the private sector. But you are running something that is known as the Wolfsberg Group, and that brings together experts from I believe 13 multinational institutions, and they provide their insight into issues such as those and others, and have been for a couple of decades. Tell us a little bit about what got them started, and then a bit about their mission.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. It's great to appear and have the ability to share. So Wolfsberg's been around since 1999, but it wasn't known as Wolfsberg back then. It was a group of banks and some other organizations that got together in the wake of private banking scandals in North America and in Europe. And there was a realization that it would be kind of useful to have some global voluntary standards for private banking to minimize the risk that people would compete for business with laxer compliance standards. So meetings in 1999 and year 2000 resulted in the publication of the private banking principles. And I suppose at the time there was some thought that it might be a one and done exercise, but the members thought that there was value in continuing. So it stayed together as and what until last year was the loosest of associations. And last year we formed ourselves as a legal entity.
Oh, it wasn't until last year that you became a legal entity. I guess I was
Yeah.
not aware of that. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, the Wolfsberg geeks would sit around the table, and I'm among them,
Right.
and we would sort of laugh about how nobody would open a bank account for us because we didn't legally exist.
So going back to the beginning parts of this, when you first weighed in on private banking, best practices, due diligence, in part, as you say, because of my words, the scandals that had occurred, the penalties at that time prior to 9/11. Obviously, I'd say the oversight wasn't as strong with the regulators.
Right.
It's not a knock on them, but I think, but that was part of the reason why Wolfsberg weighed in, it seems to me. But as they did, to the extent that you have folks that were involved at the time, why did they think what they did was going to resonate beyond the institutions? Because obviously multinational, big institutions, but there's other fairly large institutions in the States and elsewhere that also have private banking,
Right.
products that they offer. So what was the take then on, was it because they were, I don't want to say well known, I'm not trying to be facetious, but that they felt that if these large institutions weighed in, that alone would help? Or did they do some spade work, if you will, worked with the regulators, worked with law enforcement? What do you recall at the time from folks that were there that passed that on to you?
So I can only relay what I've been told because I
Right.
wasn't there for the birth. The background that is my understanding is that the original membership was comprised of the biggest private banks in their respective markets. So if you move if the major players move, then that makes it a lot easier for everybody else to follow. And I think those private banking principles, which have since been revised a couple of times, have, as a concept, have stood the test of time. And that helped the organization arrive at a conclusion that, hey, it would make probably make sense to be an organization and explore some other topics.
I mean, I certainly saw the Wolfsberg principles on private banking, or what they were called at the time, referenced by regulators, referenced in academic pieces, referenced in testimony on Capitol Hill. Again, all prior, and some post 9/11, but prior to 9/11, there definitely was articles in the trade papers about what they did and all of that. So that seemed to be, as you say, if these large institutions are weighing in and saying, look, we know we got problems, and here's some ways in which we can deal with these problems, that in and of itself is useful. So as they weighed in on private banking, then of course we had 9/11. So what from your both your experience and also folks that were involved at the time, what was their reaction? What was their response to 9/11 in terms of documentation, recommendations, and strategies?
I think you're right about this whole area not getting a huge amount of attention until 9/11, and what an awful thing to have happen in order to prompt that. My understanding is there was actually a Wolfsberg meeting pretty much underway as 9/11 happened.
Right.
There was a pretty immediate statement that went out from the Wolfsberg Group around terrorist financing. And I suspect, I don't know for sure, that led to one of the first focuses on correspondent banking. The recognition that moving money through banks was not just a business, it was a source of potentially troubling risk. And that led Wolfsberg into one of these other topics that just sort of never goes away of best practice around correspondent banking.
So jumping around a little bit, so going to today and some of the things that you guys have weighed in on recently, what's the process for Wolfsberg to take up an issue? Is it something that during a forum discussion, a couple of banks reference, something that, like, politically exposed persons is a good example, right? So PEPs wasn't something we talked about in the 90s. We might have understood that people in public office were susceptible potentially to bribes and corruption, but obviously the Patriot Act in the U.S. and certainly FATF weighed in on that. So is it a reaction to global challenges and issues, enforcement actions, or is it not that? I don't want to say that's structured, but is it more, there's something out there that they haven't currently or previously commented on? It's another issue. I think cryptocurrency would be an example. Like,
Right.
It's not that you're going to focus on that, but how is it? Because since you're running the day to day, what's the governance process structure for
Sure.
Wolfsberg?
I mean, I've been running the day-to-day since October last year.
Right.
Before that, I was a banker and had been for a long, long time. I mean, really, we approach these things from the perspective of shared challenges and shared solutions. So a topic has to be of interest to a majority of the membership before we'll proceed with any kind of work. We will then put together a working group. Has to have a majority of the membership involved. We will draft something, be it an FAQ document or a standard or a statement. We never publish anything unless all the members approve it. And if you like, then you're off to the races. You alluded to this a little bit in terms of, okay, who looks at the stuff?
Right.
Who is the audience? I think we're a credible private sector voice. We've all had our problems, or most of us have had our problems. But I think the way I look at it is there's not too many other industry groups out there that are a group of practitioners who are speaking to other practitioners. So we're obviously delighted when the regulators pick up on some of our work and leverage it. And we speak to regulators at different points of time ourselves. But the other audience is the rest of the banking community. The rest of I date myself when I say banking community. I think that the financial services sector, and also academics. And I think that there's different needs from each of those constituencies. But I mean, you mentioned PEPs. We published something recently on negative news screening. If you're a bank sitting in a country somewhere trying to figure out how the heck to do this, and your regulator is telling you that it's required, FATF is telling you that it is required at a principal level, how do you do it? So some of our work is sort of really quite tactical, and it's here, how do you go about putting these sorts of programs in place for yourself? Whereas other parts of the work are more sort of advocacy related, the work we've done on effectiveness over the last few years, as to how might we redesign the regime if we had the opportunity to do so.
Is it challenging to come up with an issue that needs to be addressed and make sure that whatever you produce is global? So obviously, you know, 20, 30 years ago, a lot of what's in the AML space was driven by the US or UK. So they were
Mhm.
sort of ahead of other countries or responded sooner, whatever words you want to attach to it. But obviously FATF has long made clear that when they weigh in on, de-risking or human trafficking or whatever it is, they talk about it as a global challenge.
Right.
Um, how do you navigate? How do your members navigate that? Is similarly, I assume that so whatever you draft, you want to make sure that it's seen as global in its response, or in some cases, is there a reference? U.S. law does X, UK law does Y, that sort of thing, or is it more higher level than that? If that makes any sense.
We try and make it higher level. We try and make it country agnostic. But I mean, that doesn't mean to say that we won't pull in as references legal requirements in specific countries. One of the things we put in pretty much all of the documents is that, your country might have a different approach to doing this, in which case that is the most important thing for you to follow.
So yeah, I mean, obviously, looking at your website, you folks have weighed in on the FinCEN's request for comment on how to improve the AML infrastructure.
Right.
So that's clearly an example of making comments specifically to U.S. based laws and issues to try to
Right.
improve them. So that, and I would urge people to read that, because obviously not only well crafted, but it does give, as you say, your group of practitioners, and I would argue very practical response to how to improve the infrastructure. So
Right.
that's something that obviously was driven by a few of your members, and others felt it was important enough to weigh in. So long-winded way of getting to, is there a lobbying aspect to Wolfsberg from outside the organization where people might come to you and say, Alan, we'd really like you on your next meeting to get this issue on the table to see if the banks want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, we wrapped up the Wolfsberg Forum in Switzerland at the end of May. It was the first time we've got together since the pandemic began. The Wolfsberg Forum is a small conference. It's around 100 people. It's a mixture
Okay.
of Wolfsberg member banks,
Mhm.
non-member banks, and regulators, public sector, and standard setters. And so it was my first experience of organizing a Wolfsberg Forum.
Mhm.
Um, and there was a lot of discussion at the forum about things that the industry would like to see Wolfsberg do. Uh, Part of the challenge around that is just getting the resourcing to do it,
Right.
because the Wolfsberg members all have day jobs,
Right.
and
Right.
they're the subject matter experts. I head the secretariat. My predecessor, Tracy Paradise,
Mhm.
um, ran the secretariat as something she did in addition to her day job. This is my day job, and we try and we get the membership to volunteer, to step up, to spend their time working on the papers that we publish. So we're always torn between, there's just so much we'd like to do,
Right.
but
Right.
there's only so many hours in the day, and there's only so many corners of the desks to do the work on.
The other thing that we talked about offline was the fact that part of the the structure of the forum, and getting 100 folks. That's actually pretty. It's more than I thought. That's pretty compelling. But you talked about how there's no press, and so it is
Right.
supposed to be, as they like to throw around, the old Chatham House rules, but basically an ability to have conversations and hopefully be more candid with those conversations. So I assume that's a big part of it. So you might have debates, as you say, within just the smaller group or within the forum, but nobody's sending information out on Twitter or LinkedIn about
Right.
we're potentially considering X, Y, or Z, which is obviously important to make this a robust discussion, right?
Well, it keeps it a safe space for the regulatory community as well. At a large AML conference, you might have the opportunity to ask a regulator, and I think we've all joked about the
Right.
standard response. It depends. Around the forum, it's been my experience, both as an organizer now and as a participant in the past, that you can have some pretty frank conversations with the regulatory community. And because there's no press, there's no broader media, there's no consultants. It's a bunch of very like-minded people, and some of the discussions that come out of that are just fantastic.
Right. So when your reports are complete, your recommendations are complete. This is a little in the weeds, but I'm very interested in this. What's your marketing strategy, high level? So you're done. So you've already had conversations, maybe at the forum, maybe with regulators. So whatever it is, and everybody agrees. All 13 signed off.
Mhm.
It's ready to go out. What's the process of getting that out from this perspective? We've talked about this again offline. There's many mid-sized, very large institutions and small institutions in the States and other places that would also benefit from Wolfsberg type recommendations, but
Right.
may or may not be aware of what you've released. In general, you have to give me the proprietary information, but what's the general strategy about getting what you've completed out so that people can take a look at it? Hopefully, some will adopt it. Whatever.
Right. So I mean, I think it's fair to say that that's evolving, and
Mhm.
we're sort of experimenting with how to do things. Everything that we publish for public consumption is on our website.
Mhm.
We have a LinkedIn, so we publish everything there as well.
Right. Right.
We will send completed papers directly to some regulators, the major regulators, especially if a regulator has been involved in giving us some input into the paper. And we are hopefully soon going to be finalizing a mailing list type arrangement. So people have been able to sign up on our website for the mailing list.
Right.
Um, Functionality hasn't been built on the back end. So we are hoping that we will have that in place by the end of the year so that we'll then be able to push these materials out to everybody who's expressed an interest in Wolfsburg generally.
And I would
One,
selfishly say this hopefully this conversation is also helpful in getting the information out. So you folks should do more of these things and perhaps do your own uh, free webinar, podcast, that sort of thing. I think that obviously, as we know in today's world, LinkedIn's great. I mean, I agree that's a great place for it to go out, and then select group of folks, as you mentioned. But I think getting things out in social media in
yeah,
various forms, that's sort of the world we live in, right?
and that's very much on our plan to do. We what I would like to try and do with some of the papers that are going to be coming out later this year, some webinars, some broader communication sessions. We have an updated correspondent banking due diligence questionnaire that'll be coming out as version
Right.
1.4.
Mhm.
All the guidance material is being revamped because when you change the questions, you have to change the guidance material. We're updating the correspondent banking principles, and we also expect to be able to publish a paper on sort of request guidance around requests for information. So that's a nice package of documents, updating some materials that have that have been out for a little while, and sort of continuing our continuous improvement process around the CBDDQ. And we wanted to do something more of a splash with when we roll those out.
Let me ask you about that because correspondent banking questionnaire over time has definitely become the standard. I don't think there's any question that your folks and your predecessors have been successful in doing that. Um, Correspondent banking, as we both know, are considered high risk activities, fairly or unfairly, right? And the adjacent issue to that has been de-risking.
Mhm.
Obviously, de-risking has been impactful for correspondent bank relationships. For something that I'm familiar with is charities and humanitarian groups. Without, I know you're still working on the questionnaire, but is that also part of the ongoing conversation that as you're doing these questionnaires, the goal is twofold. My words, not yours. Twofold. One is to ensure that there are successful correspondent bank relationships. So if you do your proper due diligence, you should be able to mitigate the risk. And then secondarily, because we've seen in the U.S. is particularly focused on de-risking in the correspondent bank space. In fact, I know from a friend that September there'll be hearings in the House side in the U.S. just on that aspect of
Mhm.
de-risking. So again, long way of getting to the question of is that also a conversation, debate, wrong word, conversation, dialogue that your folks have about also trying to improve the environment so that there can be these relationships provided the banks know what they can do to mitigate the risks.
Right. I mean, to some extent, yeah. The questionnaire itself, our challenge with the questionnaire is to ensure that it stays relevant.
Okay.
The old Wolfsberg AML questionnaire aged, and I would say that it became functionally obsolete, which is why there was such a growth of bespoke questionnaires across the industry. So the CBDDQ will continue to evolve, and its mission is to try and set an initial baseline for due diligence. No questionnaire is ever going to be able to solve everything. That's always
Right.
going to be a function of risk appetite and specialization and the types of business involved. But it provides a sort of standardized starting point for that discussion. Correspondent banking is one of those topics that is defined differently in different regulatory environments. The revised correspondent banking principles are going to focus on where we think the biggest risk is, which is relationships that permit or facilitate the processing of third-party payment activity. So we hope we can focus a bit more attention on that particular side of it. De-risking is a real challenge, but I think there's a couple of elements of de-risking that are perhaps not as well appreciated as they should be. I mean, first of all, correspondent banking is a business.
Right.
Correspondents do it because they perceive that they can make money at it. That's the basis of our economic system.
Mm-hmm.
If you wind the clock back 20 years, rightly or wrongly, but I think from the perspective of today, completely wrongly, the amount of due diligence that banks did on their correspondent relationships was a lot less than what it is today. There is a cost of doing that. And an economist would call that a fixed cost. And whatever it is, it's more today than it was 20 years ago. Payment prices seem to just keep going down.
Hmm.
So, and I've yet to speak to anybody who can really say, yeah, we charge our higher risk customers more for payments than we charge our lower risk customers. So you have a classic squeeze going on where the due diligence cost is greater. Your revenue per unit, I used to be a cash management salesperson, so we talked about P times V, price times volume.
Okay.
If you can't get the payment revenue, then your lower volume customers are going to have to go somewhere else because you can't serve them profitably. And that is one of the drivers of de-risking. It's not the only one, but I think
Right.
it's one that You won't often find a correspondent banks that says to a respondent, "We're closing your account down because we can't make money out of you." But that is behind some of it. We can't make money out of you given where we perceive the risk to be, or given where we perceive you, the respondent, to be in terms of how you manage the risk that you open us up to. I realize that's probably a rather unpopular thing to say,
Right.
because I know there are some respondents that are working like crazy on it.
Mhm.
When we rolled out the CBDDQ, there's a question in the CBDDQ. Have you chosen to benchmark your uh, AML program against US or UK or EU requirements? And that was a pretty controversial question when we first rolled it out. I think a number of people were quite offended by it.
Mm.
But what I said to them was, okay, if you're a bank in a jurisdiction that has suffered from de-risking, and you're one of 7 banks in the jurisdiction, and you're the only one that has chosen to benchmark your program against the EU and the US, and you've actually done something about that, that differentiates you in a hugely positive way over everybody else in the market.
Right.
We can't ignore these problems, but people who are seen to be working on addressing them aggressively and effectively, I think will always get a lot more attention than those that appear not to, possibly not get it.
That makes sense. Very, very much so. Two more things I want to ask you. One of your most recent papers you referenced is on effectiveness through collaboration. Just posted a couple weeks ago. Tell us a little bit about that. Obviously, urging folks to read the paper when they get a chance. What's the theme there about effectiveness, and just highlights from your perspective?
So the effectiveness through collaboration is the fourth of our effectiveness papers, and it really sort of tries to get at the heart of the smart criminals try and avoid concentration risk as much as they can. So the picture that any one bank gets is limited to the activity that flows through its books. If you have an environment where banks are allowed to share information in the US, they can under Section 314. Unfortunately, that is still something of a rarity around the world. If you have a private-public partnership, a forum where the public sector and the private sector can get together and share information as permitted under local law, then you have the framework to start building bigger networks. If you can build bigger networks, then maybe we can do a better job of taking the clever bad guys down. That has to appeal to everybody.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense. I'll get you out of here on this, Alan, and really, again, appreciate your patience in letting us do this. The forum recently met, as you mentioned, in May, and obviously you have some papers coming out toward the end of the year. Without giving away too much, what do you see as the additional challenges that our community is going to face in the next year and a half? Obviously, digital assets is something that we struggle with. We continue to be, I think, fairly proactive as an industry on anti-human trafficking, but bribery and corruption is also out there. But anything else that you see out there based on conversations with your members and just your own expertise that you think are going to continue to challenge us next year and a half?
Sure. I mean, it's hard to boil it down to just 1 or 2 items, and the danger is that somebody will say, "Well, he only said these 2."
Right.
So with that caveat, the first thing I'm going to say is payment transparency.
Mhm.
It is, years ago we talked about banks and MSBs as the only way to move money around cross-border, and generally you had the domestic low-value payment systems, and you had the cross-border wire transfer systems. Increasingly, we see really innovative use of blending different payment channels, different sets of payment rails to deliver payments more cheaply and more efficiently. The problem is those payment rails weren't necessarily designed for that type of transaction. The US is a little bit different again because it has IAT as a format for its ACH. But that old saying that ACH systems are low value, repetitive, non-urgent payments is wrong, wrong, wrong. I think most people probably don't realize that the largest payment you can send via the US ACH system is a penny short of $1 billion. That's not low value in my mind. So the challenge there, different participants, different rules, different requirements. We're firm adherents of this principle of same business, same rules, same regulation. I would add same regulator as well, but that's just a personal view. The second thing that I would focus on, you got it right, virtual asset service providers.
Right.
One of the benefits of the gray hair that I have is that there doesn't seem to be anything too terribly much new anymore. Virtual asset service providers look an awful lot like MSBs 20 years ago.
Right.
They do the same sort of thing. They do it in a different way. They are otherly regulated, and in some jurisdictions, they may not be regulated at all. So, if you're asking a bank to say, yeah, I'm going to bank this type of entity, then why would the bank do it? And then I hear a lot of talk where in some quarters where some members of the financial services industry will voluntarily follow regulatory requirements. That's great, but it's no substitute for being required to. If you mess up on something that you voluntarily try and follow, you get embarrassed. If you're a bank and you mess up on something that you're supposed to do, you get fined. You get humiliated.
Right.
And rightly so if it's an egregious violation. So I think our capacity for innovation is wonderful. It is fantastic. I mean, I can now send money cross-border for very little money, but very little money doesn't pay for much of a compliance program.
Right. Well, I think that all makes sense. Alan Ketley, the new executive secretary of Wolfsberg, really appreciate your time. I tell folks for the papers and the information, you go to Wolfsberg. Actually, just go to Google Wolfsberg Group and the website will come up and you can get on a list. But obviously, reading and understanding the focus of a number of their papers. We've already mentioned a few. Obviously, the correspondent banking. They focus also on trade finance, politically exposed persons, the collaboration one that was just issued. So these become valuable. Obviously, I think it's really good to know, and I sort of did know this, but not until you said it was I 100% sure that all 13 institutions have to sign off. And I think that alone tells you it's not just a consensus, it's a total agreement. And I think that helps better understand the value of the information that's getting provided. So, Alan, thanks so much for your time today. Really, really appreciate it. Good luck down the line.
John, thank you for the opportunity. It's been great chatting with you. And Wolfsberg-principles.com if you want to read anything that we publish.
Thanks for listening to another episode of AML Conversations, brought to you by AML RightSource. To make sure you're staying up to date with what's going on in the industry, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast to get the latest episode.